we can actually get started with our lesson. And we will be looking at the story of the 10 plagues. So if you want to, you can go ahead and open up to Exodus. But in reality, what we're going to be doing is working our way through the plagues with the understanding or the assumption that we already know the story. And if you don't know the story, you can start in chapter 7. That's really where the plagues begin, and it goes through chapter 12 of Exodus. But we're going to start with looking at a little bit of context and then also taking a look at the text that was read for us in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 12. So, starting with a little bit of context, well, even before that. We hopefully know the story of the 10 plagues. I think most of the Western world knows the story of the 10 plagues to some degree or another. But tonight what we want to do is ask the question, why did God send these 10 seemingly random events on the Egyptian people? Why would he choose these things? And imagine just for a second that you've never read the Bible at all. And I hand you a list of 10 items and say, how do these go together? How do they go together? And if we take a step back from just what we learn maybe as children in Bible school and we ask the question, why? Why did God send these things on the people of Egypt? Well, tonight we're going to try to offer an answer to that. At least one answer that's pretty commonly suggested, but maybe you haven't heard before. So we're going to go into this, but let's start with a little bit of context. So the story of the plagues is really the story of the beginning of the Hebrew people. And so after the first few patriarchs, you have Joseph, of course, ending up in slavery in Egypt. His family will join him there. He isn't in slavery at the time, though. He's second or third in command of the whole nation. And so his family comes there during time of famine in the land of Canaan. So they're all together there. Over time, it's forgotten who they really are, that they were important, that they were even saviors of the people of Egypt. And so, after a while, they become slaves. And they'll spend about 400 years in Egypt, a lot of that time as slaves, but the population of the now Jewish people explodes. And we're talking about over 1 million people by the time that the Exodus takes place. And of course, God will call Moses to be a leader to bring his people up out of the land of Egypt to save them. And when he is sent, the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, the person in charge, is unwilling to let the Israelites go with Moses and away from the land of Egypt. And so God sends plagues on the land of Egypt. A plague, generally we think of it as a sickness. Not all of these are sicknesses, really. Only a few of them are. And so disasters may be a better word to put in there, but some kind of negative events. And there's a series of them that will happen. Most of them don't last very long. Most of them only last a few days, maybe up to a week. And then Pharaoh says, okay, I've had it, you can go. And then he changes his mind. And so hopefully we're familiar with that story anyway. All of these plagues will build up to the 10th plague, which is the worst, we would all have to agree. And after that, Pharaoh finally says, okay, you can leave, and then only to try to catch up with them later and get himself and his army drowned in the Red Sea. The other bit of context that's pretty important for what we're going to be talking about is the multitude of Egyptian gods. There are, in the Egyptian pantheon, which pantheon, if you don't know, is a word it's a two-part word, pan meaning all, and theos meaning God. And so it's all the gods of Egypt. But the Egyptian pantheon contains no less than 1,500 different named gods and goddesses, or at least minor gods. That's a lot. We have one God, and most of the Western world has one God, and even parts of the rest of the world have one God. So we're kind of used to monotheism, just having one God. That's not how it was, though. They had gods that controlled everything individually, not a God that ruled over all, but a God over, for example, hunting, a God over fertility, a God of the horizon, a God of war, a God of embalming, a God of just every little specific task that had to be done. Again, though, at that time, that's the standard. At that time, that is the rule, and monotheism is the exception. Having one God is the exception. Today, it's almost the opposite of that. So where we're unfamiliar with this, it was pretty normal for the Egyptians to have a vast number of gods. But what we want to do is we want to take what we've said so far, the story of the people of the Hebrews leaving the land of Egypt, and then also the idea of the Egyptian gods, and sort of put that together. And so what we see is a couple things. One, we hope to give meaning to the plagues more than we've understood before, but we want to be able to answer questions in a satisfactory way that we have about these plagues. So if I were to ask the question, well, wouldn't one plague have done as well as 10 plagues? Or for that matter, why not have 25 plagues instead of 10? What does the number matter? Well, I'm not sure if it's the number specifically, but why go through a series of events? Why not just start with the last plague? Why not start with the death of the firstborn? That seemed to be good enough to get the people released, so why go through the rest of this process? And there are probably other answers to this. So just for a second, how else could you answer this question besides what our thesis is for tonight? It may be that God's just trying to wear Pharaoh down. I think that's probably part of this. Pharaoh is stubborn from everything that we see, and so it may take more than one event to convince him that he needs to change his ways. So maybe he's getting worn down. But there also is probably an aspect in which God is targeting these plagues specific to the people that he is trying to convince to change their minds. And so one verse that we see that does a lot to support this idea is the verse that was read for us in Exodus chapter 12 and in verse 12. The beginning of the verse just says, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night," speaking of the night of the Passover, where the firstborn son will be killed, but not in the houses of the Hebrews. "I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night. I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast." But then it says one more thing. God is not just striking man and beast. He's not just getting them involved in this judgment on the Egyptians. He says that I will also strike against all the gods of Egypt, and I will execute my judgment. I am the Lord. Okay, so why does this matter? Well, because we want to take this a step farther and suggest this, and this is our idea, that God, at least in part, is using these 10 plagues to show the people of Egypt not just his miraculous power, but specifically to, in almost an ironic way, to destroy the credibility of the very gods that the people of Egypt worship. And so what we'll do is we'll take the plagues one by one, and we'll give at least some reasons that each of these plagues is tied either to specific Egyptian gods or even to Egyptian ways of life. And so we'll give a little bit of a historical background to what God is doing here. Now, certainly it's enough to say that God did this because he wanted to do it. And that would be fair for us to say, well, God chose to do it because that was his plan. Okay, great. Doesn't God usually act with a purpose? Doesn't God usually have something in mind when he makes some kind of action, especially a negative one against a large group of people? And so we're going to try to line these plagues up with the historical situation of Egypt at the time. Okay, let's get started so we get a better idea of what we're talking about. Again, if you go back to chapter 7, you'll get the first plague of turning the water to blood. That starts in verse 14. Like I said, if you want to follow along in your Bible, it's easy enough to do. Chapter 7, we'll start with that in verse 14. Chapter 8 begins with the second plague of the frogs. And so we'll go on like that. But with the water being turned to blood, there's a few things that we would want to say. The first one is probably the most obvious, which is that turning the water to blood, especially in the land of Egypt, is an affront to their very culture. Because it's no stretch to say that Egypt is the Nile River, that the Nile River is Egypt. There's really about one other significant oasis off to the west part of Egypt, and there's a few others that dot the desert around the area. But even today, if you were to pull up a map of Egypt as viewed from outer space at nighttime, The lights will be in one silver string that follows the Nile River. People do not live within or without about 2 miles of either side of the Nile, almost anywhere. And so, especially at this time, that would be all the more true. But the Nile River is the all-important lifeblood of the people of Egypt. And so what does God do initially? Well, the first thing he does is says, this river that's all important to you, I'm the one that's in control of that. Now, what does that do more specifically here, though? Well, there are gods, of course, false gods of the Egyptians that are associated with the Nile River itself. There's the god of Khnum, who is the guardian of the Nile's source, which I don't suppose they actually knew what it was at the time. Today, we would understand it to be Lake Victoria, farther south in Africa, and also a separate lake in Ethiopia. But he's supposed to be the god of the source of the Nile. Well, if he is, then he's falling down on the job, right? He's allowed the water to turn to blood. That's kind of a problem. There's also a god named Hapi, who is the god of both flooding. There are other flooding gods too. Every year the Nile would flood its banks, which would allow for the sediment that became the fertile land on either side of the Nile that could be used for crops. Also a fish god too, though, Hapi is. So we have 2 gods specifically that are going to be affected by this. And when the people of Egypt look at their own river and they say, aren't these gods supposed to be taking care of this river? What does that do for them? And when they hear that the God of the Hebrews is the one that has done this, well, does that maybe start to convince somebody? There's another idea with this. I'll bring it up at the end, actually. But there is another idea that we'll talk about it after a while. So let's move on to the frogs in chapter 8 then. Frogs are one of the plagues that I think makes almost no sense if there's not some other motive behind it. It's one thing to say that God sent frogs because he wanted to, but if that's his plan, if that's his purpose, and that's all there is to it, why? I mean, if there were millions of frogs that came into Garrett County tomorrow, it would be annoying. It would be kind of repulsive in a lot of ways too, because they would be everywhere. But why? What's the real purpose behind that? Just to make the Egyptians kind of mad? Is that really going to get them to kick the people of Israel out of their land? Doesn't seem too likely. Maybe there's more to it. Specifically, there is an Egyptian god, Heket, who is depicted as having the body of a human and the head of a frog, which is kind of strange to start with. But this god, or goddess rather, would seem to be almost mocked in this situation. Now, Heket is a god of flooding, for one, but also a god of childbirth, which may be more to the point here. What problem did the Egyptians have with the Hebrews? Well, the Hebrews were having too many children, and so the Egyptians decided that they were going to kill all of the male children that were born to the Hebrews. And if you're going to not only send frogs on the land to almost mock the god that has this frog appearance, you're also saying that God has no power, especially over childbirth, which I have the power over. God has the power over, I'm saying. So it may be in response to the mistreatment of the Hebrews in regard to bearing children. The third plague that is mentioned is lice or fleas. It could really be either. It's kind of the same idea either way. But lice is a little bit different in what we're looking at, because lice was a problem maybe more so in the ancient world than it is today, partially because of hygiene, partially just because of the areas in which they live. But specific to Egypt, lice had been a problem historically, and you can find this information elsewhere. But if you've ever seen depictions of Egyptian priests, particularly, they will almost always have their heads shaved. And not only their heads, but a lot of times even their eyebrows will be shaved off. And a lot of that comes from the problem of lice and the problem, just like with Hebrew priests, they had to remain in a state of cleanliness. And so if you have lice, obviously you're not fit to serve as priest, and so they would keep their heads shaved. And so what happens here? Well, what happens is God turns the dust of the earth into the very thing that they already have a problem with. Well, that's pretty bad. That's unfortunate for the Egyptians who already struggle with this, but it also shows power of God maybe against the priesthood of Egypt, but also against the earth itself, or over the earth itself. God has this power. The Egyptian god Geb is the one who's supposed to be in control of the earth and even the soil. And yet again, we would find them missing in action. And the Egyptians would have to say, okay, if the Hebrew God can do this, but our God's not taking care of us, then who really has control here? The next plague that takes place is the plague of the flies, or more literally swarms. And so it's not specific as to what kind of insect it is, but insects of some sort. If it is flies, it's probably not house flies, which is unpleasant to think about. It's probably horse flies, something on a larger scale. That would get pretty old pretty fast, if you ask me at least. A couple of years from now, we will have a recurrence of the 17-year cicadas that come around. And so if you were here the last time that happened, it's going to be a lot of fun, right? Imagine that taking place, except probably even on a greater scale than what we're talking about in our case. So that's what's going to happen, but this does a couple things. One, the Egyptians actually kind of liked flies. We don't really like them, but they almost admired them for their persistence, especially in terms of association with warfare. And so they kind of viewed flies as, you keep swatting away a fly, it keeps coming back. It's almost like you can't get rid of it. So they're pesky, they're persistent, or even resilient. And so they would associate sometimes, at least warriors, with flies even. And so maybe this is part of what's being intended here. It's something that they kind of look up to, and yet God's, again, lowering the reputation of the fly. There's also, similar to what we said before with Heket being the head of a frog in the body of a person, the god Khepri is similarly depicted as the body of a human and the head either of a beetle or of a fly. And actually either one would work because we're talking about swarms here, not specific to flies. And so it would be hard to think that the Egyptians would still have a lot of affinity for the fly after dealing with this. And so again, we see God's power over others. Now, we'll cover the next few a little bit quicker. We have next disease coming upon cattle. This really does a couple things. One, there are 3 different gods that are depicted in sort of a cattle form. Hathor probably being the best known one, and then Hassat and Apis. And so all of these gods and goddesses, they're depicted as a bull or as being the body of a human and having some kind of cattle-like features. The other side of this, though, is that cattle were kind of held up and revered as almost a sacred symbol. And so both of those things are done away with when God diseases cattle. The next thing is boils, the next plague. And so boils are the first thing that really directly affect people. Everything up to this point has been unfortunate. It's been annoying. It's been devastating even, but it didn't affect you. And so at this point, things start to become personal whenever you have boils on yourself, but it also becomes personal for the gods of Egypt. If you are an Egyptian at this time and you get sick, what do? Well, Egypt, for one, has better medical care than a lot of the ancient world. In fact, they sort of took pride in their medical knowledge. How much help was that? None. Well, how many gods are there in Egypt that are supposed to be able to be sacrificed to or prayed to that can heal? Well, there's a few. Specifically, there's Isis and Sekhmet and Imhotep. And so we look at these gods and we say, well, aren't they supposed to be able to heal me? They're supposed to. But if they can't, well, then what does that prove? It proves that your God is nothing and that the God of the Hebrews is something much more powerful. The next plague is hail and fire, but fire, as seen in the Old Testament especially, and in this context even more so, really should refer to lightning, not fire coming down from the sky, but a flash of fire in the sky, as it were. There's not a separate Hebrew word that's used there. So lightning should be the understanding, but hail and lightning, yet again, why pray? Why sacrifice to a God who's not protecting you from these things? Nut, who is the sky god, who's one of the more important Egyptian gods, is supposed to be taking care of this. It's not happening. Now, you already had cattle that were diseased, but what happens here? Well, the cattle that are left out in the field, they die too. And even the crops in the field, they get destroyed. And the crops that weren't destroyed by the hail get destroyed by plague number 8, locusts. Locusts come in and they eat everything that is green. And so they're going to destroy whatever's left of the grain. There's a pair of Egyptian gods, actually, that are the gods over grain, or the gods over wheat specifically. And so whatever the hail didn't get now is being destroyed. You pray to the gods for a good harvest, for a good crop this year, and they say no, because apparently the God of the Hebrews is a little bit more powerful than they are. The last 2 plagues. The 9th plague is darkness. Now this, I think, again, is one of the stranger plagues. Why send darkness over the land? It's kind of annoying. If you can't see anything around you, it's a little bit scary maybe. And that may be enough reason for God to do this, but isn't there another reason? Especially in Egyptian mythology, isn't there another reason for this? Who is the primary god of Egypt? His name is Ra. His name is Ra. Ra is the creator god in Egyptian mythology, but he is the sun god. He's the god that's represented by the midday sun, the full red sun. He's the god who supposedly his tears created mankind. His tears became mankind. He's the God who rules over the world. He's the God that's most worshipped by the Egyptians. He's the God that's supposed to be the first pharaoh of Egypt and then became the god Ra. He is the sun god, as we said. And so if you want to embarrass a whole religion, if you want to disprove an entire belief system, then what do? Well, if you're God, all you have to do is say, you worship the sun god. Let me show you who has control of the sun. It's not your God, it's the God of the Hebrews. It's the God that will take them out of the land of Egypt to save them. The last plague. The last plague is the death of the firstborn, specifically the male in the family. On the one hand, that seems like an unjust punishment. But even that by itself, apart from any discussion of gods, has a point, doesn't it? Why did the firstborn male of the houses of Egypt die? It may sound like a harsh punishment, but is that any more than the Egyptians had just done to the Hebrews? God says, if you're going to kill my sons, this is going to be the result. And so that's the first thing we might say, that this is a little bit of almost retributive justice on the death of the males of the Hebrews. But the other thing, in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 29, it kind of gives us the extent of what happens in this event. It says, and it came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. First off, that verse is very well written. I know the whole Bible is, but just the way that it phrases that to say the firstborn of Pharaoh sitting on the throne to the firstborn of the slave in the dungeon and everybody in between. Maybe not so much for the person in the dungeon. Maybe that's not the emphasis here. But in Egyptian culture and in Egyptian mythology, many of the pharaohs actually would become gods after their lifetime. At least they would become worshipped as gods after their lifetime, is what we're saying. And so what happens when you take the royal family, who's not only the royal family, but the sacred family, and the family that connects you as a human to the gods? And you take that family and you say, you know, that family that's supposed to be holier, that's supposed to be better and mightier than you, even they are not exempt from what's happening in these plagues. Even they cannot stand up against the God of the Hebrews. Even they are affected just the same as everyone else. And so maybe that family that you revere, that you hold up here as being something special to the common people of Egypt, maybe they're not what you think. It's maybe no wonder then that after all this takes place, the Egyptians are ready to get rid of them, to the point that they even give them things for their journey. The common people say, you know what, get out, take this with you, we're done. Because they've recognized that the God of the Hebrews, after all of this, is greater than any God that Egypt has ever worshipped, that they've ever had. So, what do we do with this? Well, Hopefully, with all of these things that we've talked about tonight, I hope it's thought-provoking. That's the goal here. I hope that you lay in bed tonight and think a little bit more about it and think, maybe there's a little bit more reason that we can give to this. But it is more than just an interesting topic. That being said, I've tried to present this topic conservatively to you, and what I mean is that you can go too far with this. And there are people, there are articles that you can read that make almost wild assumptions about what the Egyptians believed or what they did just to try to get a point across from what God did in the plagues. For example, there is very little evidence of what I'm about to say, so that's why I didn't include it. But when it comes to the plague of turning the water in the Nile into blood, some people think that maybe the Egyptians believed that the flood waters of the Nile, which had kind of a red tinge to them from the clay that had been picked up upstream, that red water, some people think that maybe the Egyptians thought that it was the blood of the god of the underworld, Osiris. Now that would be pretty nice for our understanding of this. Why? Because Osiris is like 1, 2, 3, 4, somewhere in there in the ranks of importance of the gods of Egypt, right? He is way up there in importance. And so it would be nice to be able to point to that and say, oh, God struck against the god Osiris. Isn't that a great point? Well, yeah, but there's not enough evidence to say one way or the other that that actually took place. And so the warning here is this is a neat idea, but you can take it too far. And people certainly do that. So we don't want to be guilty of that. But the other thing I think this is important for, this whole lesson, is that it helps us make better sense of why God did what he did. And if you've never stopped to think about it before, just ask yourself that question. Why did God choose these 10 things? Of all the possibilities set before him, why these 10? And of course, partly it is to show his power against or over all nature. That part's true. But I think we can safely say, especially according to Exodus chapter 12 and verse 12, that God is doing this in part to strike against the gods of Egypt themselves and to show that they have no real power. And that shouldn't really come as a surprise to us. I think it actually came up in class this morning just a little bit. You remember what happened whenever the Ark of the Covenant was taken by the Philistines and it was taken into the temple of Dagon? What happened to Dagon? The statue fell on its face before the Ark of the Covenant, as if it were worshiping it. God has almost a sense of humor sometimes when it comes to these things, or a sense of irony at least, to say, you think this way, but let me show you why that's wrong. And so God certainly is not, it wouldn't be surprising for us to see him act in this way. One question I kind of thought of, maybe this is what you can think of tonight. If God today were to send plagues on the modern day people, we'll say in our own nation, what do you think the plagues would be? If he tailored them to the gods that we worship, what do you think those plagues would look like? I don't really know for sure, but do you think there'd be a plague against banks? Seems possible. You think there'd be a plague against politics? That might not sound that bad, but it would be pretty bad. Maybe it would be a plague against the theories of evolution, a plague against other false world religions of today. But God acts with a purpose. And even in the destruction of a people, he can make his point known, even to us down through the centuries, but certainly to the people who experienced it at the time. Those Egyptians that lived in that land at that time, that worshiped those gods, they themselves would have a real problem with their own worship of their own gods, and then seeing how powerful this new God of the Hebrews really is. But the real focus of this, as much as it is a sort of referendum on the gods of Egypt, the most important factor in this is that God is showing his care for his people. However he accomplishes that, whatever ulterior motives he has behind that, he is taking care of his new people. He's bringing them from a place of danger and a place of oppression to a place of safety and a place of peace. It'll take them a few more years to get there through a lot of fault of their own, but he's showing his care for them. More specifically, he's showing, like we mentioned with the burning bush last week, he's showing that he has the power to destroy, But while he's destroying, he has the power right in the middle of that destruction to save that which he is willing to save. And we see that especially in the 10th plague and in the Passover, where there is destruction, but he saves his own people yet again. And we also don't have to limit this to the power of God against the powers or the false powers of the false gods of Egypt, but he does show in this that he is powerful over everything. Over water, over blood, over health, over life, over death. God has that power. This evening, in the way of an invitation, the invitation is simple enough. God has power. Do not ignore the power of God. The Egyptians tried to ignore it. They were stubborn in not releasing the Jews, but he does have the power to destroy, as we've said, but he has the power to save as well. Tonight, if you need to be saved by the power of God, this is a great opportunity for you. I don't always lay out the plan of salvation, but tonight, if you've heard the word, if you believe that word to be true and believe in God, if you have sin in your life that needs to be repented of, and if you confess that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and are willing to be baptized for the remission of your sins, then this is the perfect opportunity for that to happen. Tonight, if there's any other need that you have of the church, we ask that you would come forward as we stand and as we sing.
There's a fountain